Hey everyone, if you made it this far, thanks for listening, and thanks for Chris for having me on. This was kind of a difficult discussion today, as we discussed opioids and the war on drugs, and we kind of threw in our personal experiences with it and kind of reasons why we have an opinion on this. So if you made it this far, thank you for watching, listening, and you can find me at on X at Friendly UPS Man, and you can find the podcast on Substack, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify at Miller Talk. Go ahead and go follow Chris on X at JBU Show, JBU_show, and go follow him on Spotify and Apple Podcasts at Just Between Us, and leave a like and a review, rate it 5 stars. It's great. I love this guy. And thank you guys for watching today and listening. Until next time, guys. Thank you.
Hi, Austin.
Hello, everyone.
And what's your Substack again?
Miller Talk.
Miller Talk.
Yes.
Substack.com, right?
Yes.
All right. So you can go ahead and check that out. And he's at Friendly UPS Man on X, which is where I actually know you from. And we've had a few kind of little conversations here and there, but we've never really had a long discussion before. And we were talking about freedoms and the opioid crisis and kind of things along those lines the other day. And you said that you thought I was kind of oversimplifying it a little bit, I think, if I remember correctly. And so I wanted to have that conversation on the show where we had a little more time to discuss it, and it's a lot easier when I'm not limited to 160 characters or 240 or whatever it is. Let me grab this real fast so I can pull up the exact context. Unless, do you have it handy there?
I don't.
Okay, give me just 1 second. I just had it, and then I clicked on your profile. Let's see. Oh, that's right. We were talking kind of in the realm of gun laws, and you said every gun law is unconstitutional, which I'm pretty sure I agree with completely. I've gone back and forth several times on that. You know, whether or not how do you deal with felons and how do you deal with dangerous individuals and things like that. But ultimately, I mean, freedom is a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to accept that responsibility if you want that freedom, I guess. Do you have anything starting there that you want to elaborate with?
Yeah, I'd say freedom really is it's a big responsibility. But yeah, that whole situation is complicated.
Yeah, there's no question about that. I mean, every time we investigate a new Supreme Court case or a law on this show, I mean, it generally takes more than 1 3-hour episode just to decipher that one minute detail of what's going on. So then, going down a little farther, we started discussing. Sorry, it's difficult for me to talk and read.
Yeah.
More or less, I mean, the difference between constitutional rights and what the limits are to those, whether you can outlaw them or not. And when we got to the point of kind of drugs, we'll go ahead and just move straight to that. I've seen in Washington State, we've tried, which is where I live, we've tried legalization when it comes to marijuana, and we've tried decriminalization when it comes to other drugs. And then we've also, you know, it wasn't that long ago that everything was illegal. And of those three choices, which I'm not sure. Is there any other option that you see besides those three?
Mm, not really.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think there is. At least I've no one's ever brought
Mm-hmm.
anything up that makes sense to me that doesn't fall into one of those three
Yes.
categories. Um, so of those three things and what I have seen, legalization seems to be it's not necessarily the best way to deal with drugs, but I think it's
Mm-hmm.
the only I think it's the best solution that is also consistent with the Constitution and with freedom or liberty, I should say.
Yes. The right of the individual to choose what they would like to do, even if it's harmful to them.
Exactly. Yeah. So what about that do you think is oversimplified, I guess?
Yeah, I just think when we take a look at the opioid epidemic as a whole, um, it gets kind of complicated. And so I am, for the most part, in uh, for full legalization of all drugs, except for when it comes to like opiates and fentanyl. That's where I start having, like a mental wrestling match, uh, because fentanyl is just so dangerous
Yeah, it
that
absolutely is.
I don't really think it should be sold just like the way weed or alcohol or cigarettes, whatever, are sold. Just slapping a label on it saying, this will cause death if overused. Well, for a normal person, that type of opioid will kill you in just the tiniest amount, the amount that would fit on the head of a penny. But to someone
Right.
who's been using opioids for a long time, they can use quite a bit of that too, by building up a tolerance.
Yeah, I see, no shortage of it here. There's actually in the town that I live in because it's kind of a dying town. There's no industry here. It's like 35 or 45% drug use in this town. It's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely insane. It's affected at least half of the kids that I went to high school with, as well as just about everybody I know at some time or another, myself included. Ironically, it wasn't here. I was living in California at the time, and a doctor, when I was 18, prescribed me a massive amount of opiates for
Mm-hmm.
a minor back injury. And that's all, long been dealt with, but it definitely I recognize the difficulty of dealing with it because of that. Not to
Mm-hmm.
mention my mother, who I've had on the show before. I'm not sure how she'll love me talking about this necessarily, but she struggled with it for a
Mm-hmm.
lot of her life as well. So I saw it as a kid. Um, and actually, the co-host of the show used to be there was two of us,
Mm-hmm.
me and my friend Tim, used to do the show with me, and that's we've addressed it a little bit here and there, but not necessarily directly. But that's why he no longer does the show with me. I'm very happy to say that he's doing good now and has been for
That's good.
quite a long time. But that was a hard fought road too, and a lot of back and forth. If you were to go back and listen to the show over the last 5 years, there is there's a lot of him kind of popping in for a couple episodes and then popping out, and that's because he'd either get arrested or get better for a week or two, and then unfortunately fall back to it. But I think that there's two separate things here, right? There's the legality of the drug and the law-abiding citizen, and then there's dealing with the addicts and the crime that goes along with it.
Yes.
Excuse me. I get what you're saying as far as fentanyl because it
Mm-hmm.
is. I mean, fentanyl scares the hell out of me, especially with my kids,
Yes.
because my son came home one day. The town that I live in is I think I just mentioned it's an old logging town.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of really old history here because it was one of the first towns settled in this
Oh wow.
state. and so we like to find glass bottles and stuff, old glass bottles, because they're, I mean, almost anywhere you turn here, you can dig somewhere and find some. Well, then one day on his own, when he was out playing with his friend out, somewhere down the road, he comes home with a meth pipe,
Mm.
and thank God it was one that had never been used.
Yeah.
But yeah, he just thought it was a cool glass thing. He didn't know what it was.
Mm-hmm.
But had somebody used that to smoke fentanyl, I mean, he could have died
Yeah.
before even getting to the house. And so that was, that prompted me to go and buy the, what is it called, the Narcan or whatever. And
Mm-hmm.
I had no choice but at that point to expose my kids to that world, so they understood you can't do that. You can't just touch things that you find on the ground around here. It's
Yeah.
too dangerous. And that wasn't a problem. I mean, even 5 years ago, it wasn't a problem.
Wow.
My significant other, she had two stepbrothers who were they've pretty much been addicts their whole life, and unfortunately, both of them have now passed, and that was
Mm.
more or less due to fentanyl. I mean, it was
Mm-hmm.
due to their addiction, but
Yeah.
it was relapses, and because actually in both cases, when they had quit, they were doing heroin, but then when they relapsed, they did fentanyl, which was way too much for them. Excuse me. Um, so I get what you're saying there, but at the same time, it's not as if there isn't. I'm trying to think of a comparison. It's not as if there's not very deadly chemical compounds out
Mm-hmm.
there that exist,
Yes.
that they might not be drugs, but they could easily, do that kind of damage to somebody. Not to mention, it only takes one bullet misfired from a firearm to kill somebody too, right? So
Yeah.
it's all in that personal responsibility realm, I
Mm-hmm.
feel,
Yeah, I understand you there.
as to dealing with it. But I do think, I don't think it's as simple as you just make it legal and available to everybody. I do think that you have to, with things that are that level of dangerous, that are either extremely addictive or extremely deadly if you're not very careful with how you use it. Um, it would have to be. I relate it to kind of like over the counter medicine now.
Yeah.
Like I don't know if you've ever bought pseudoephedrine before, which is I guess one of the precursor drugs to making meth. So you have to actually go to the pharmacist and show ID and all of that in order to buy it. Um, and that is it's just an allergy medication. But
Mm-hmm.
back in the day, they used to buy caseloads of it
Oh yeah.
in order to make a tiny bit of meth. And so now every law-abiding citizen for time in perpetuity has to show their ID, and they can only buy one box at a time. Because it's so difficult to weed out the person that's buying a truckload versus the person buying a couple extra boxes because it's a good sale.
Mm-hmm.
But I think of it kind of like that, where you could take those more dangerous medicines, and there could still be a barrier there that puts somebody between you and getting it, so there can be a conversation there.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, there's a personal responsibility to know what you're putting into your body.
Exactly. Yes.
So let's talk about why decriminalization doesn't work, and why uh, making it illegal, I think, doesn't work. And that'll kind of bring us to why I think legalization is the best. Um, like I said, in this state, we've tried all three. When I was in high school, um, I'm not going to say exactly what year, but uh, when I was in high school, it was just before marijuana became legal, but it was still pretty socially acceptable in this state. If you got pulled over and you had less than a pound on you, uh, and the cop didn't want to be a dick just to be a dick, it was pretty unlikely you'd even get a ticket for it. because it's just kind of always been prevalent in this state. Fairly ironically, this was until, I guess, until about 9/11. This was probably the freest state in the nation.
Hmm.
We had one of the strongest state constitutions, and it was a state that really valued liberty over anything else, which surprises me to learn because as I've always grown up in it, it's always been a progressive hellhole.
Yeah.
But that history is there, and that's part of the reason why it's taken them so long to really stomp on our gun rights here, is because our state constitution went so much farther than the federal constitution, which really made it difficult for them until they had a supermajority, which they unfortunately have now. But the point is, while it was illegal, it was still extremely prevalent. At 16, I had no problem going to buy weed if I wanted to, and I did. I mean, there was literally probably a dozen different numbers in my phone that I could buy weed from, and I could have had 100 if I wanted to. There was no difficulty whatsoever to get it. And in fact, at the time, being under 18, it was probably much easier for me when it was illegal, because there was no extra penalty for selling to somebody underage.
Mm-hmm.
It was just weed is illegal or weed is legal. And to be fair, because weed is, I hate to say a lesser drug,
Yeah.
but it is kind of.
Mm-hmm.
The police were much more concerned with the more dangerous narcotics and stuff, so that was part of it. It's not just that the laws are entirely ineffective, it's also that there were higher priorities, but it certainly wasn't stopping anybody from growing, selling, or smoking weed just because it was illegal, either
Mm-hmm.
statewide or federal. So I think, I don't know, I'm sure we agree, right, that the drug war overall has been a pretty failed concept.
Yes. Yes.
Apologies. Okay, good. Let me. My buttons aren't working. There we go. I had to blow my nose, so I had to figure out how to mark that. So the drug war, we agreed with that. The drug war doesn't work. So then that leaves decriminalization and legalization.
Mm-hmm.
I think that well, let's compare the two in this state, and then if you have any examples that you want to bring up, we can do that. But obviously, I'm most familiar with what I've seen happen firsthand.
Yeah.
It started with the legalization of weed, and that was in. Let me ask Rock real quick exactly what year. Washington legalized. I want to say it was 2015, 2012. That was a little longer ago than I thought. And when it first happened, on one hand, some people were happy about it. The more kind of libertarian side of liberals just saw it as, the state seeing a bunch of dollar signs and that they would still be growing and smoking their own marijuana. They were unhappy that it was going to be strictly regulated, basically, so that the state could keep its tax money and all of that. Which, in general, I agree with. For the most part, my leanings are libertarian. I call myself a conservative,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm pretty libertarian on most things. I do think there are some things that there is a purpose for government, whereas more
Yeah.
radical libertarians are closer to anarchy, I think, than
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Where do you line up on that?
Uh, Most people call me a libertarian. I try to be like, I like to say that I'm just an American and I just want what's best for America.
Fair enough.
But people will put me in the category of like conservative or libertarian because I just want this like smallest amount of government and least amount of government involved with the individual.
That I absolutely agree with. But I do think that there is some level of government that
Mm-hmm.
is maybe not necessary, but desired.
Yeah.
I mean, you have, excuse me, you have to have a common defense, right? You have to have some way to interact with foreign nations. Because if we were just a bunch of individuals running around with absolutely no government, no centralized or organized front, then what's to stop Russia or China from just moving in? You
Mm-hmm.
know,
Yeah.
and yeah, we could fight them off, but without any sort of coordination or effort,
Yep.
how do you create F-35s and all? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You've got to come together on that stuff. And you can say, well, it's not a government; it's just a bunch of people voluntarily. But at the end of the day, it starts to resemble a government. You can call it whatever you want, but it still becomes a government of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of underlying flaw I see with libertarians that just it's almost like they oppose the word government more than they
Yeah.
oppose the idea of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I just believe government is evil in nature and well, maybe not in nature, but like our founding fathers said, like it's a necessary evil. Uh, so we just have to make sure we're keeping checks on it to make sure it doesn't go, you know, buck wild or anything.
I agree. I think what I would say is that it inevitably tends towards evil. So
Mm-hmm. It tends
it's
towards
not evil
corruption.
in itself, but anytime you're organizing or centralizing power, if you just let it go, it's going to become evil at the end of the day. Unless, like you said, you're constantly checking up on it. I think you constantly need to be, maybe every 25 years, maybe it's every 50, maybe it's every 100 years, you need to be pulling back a lot of that power. Even if you think it's running relatively good, I still
Mm-hmm.
think you need to reassess and go,
Yeah.
okay, there's a little too much power concentrating here. How can we pull that back? Because even without progressives, things still tend to progress.
Yeah.
And that progression, I think that's kind of what makes me a conservative instead of a libertarian, because I'm trying to conserve what was originally created, if that makes sense. That's the way I
Yeah.
see it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and just as a function of time and human nature, the farther time wise that we get away from the creation of the thing, the more change is going to happen naturally.
Yes.
All right. So anyway, how how that relates to weed is I definitely agreed that the way that we legalized it wasn't perfect, but no matter what, I think that the legalization was a correct step, because ultimately at the end of the day, the vast majority of people that are consuming marijuana are decent, working, or otherwise law abiding citizens
Mm-hmm.
that aren't hurting anybody else. And you can't punish those people to get to the people that are. In general, the crime comes with the dealers, it comes with the people that are trying to make the money off it because they want to eliminate the competition and protect their dollars and all of that. And then the crime aspect does change a little bit when it comes to addictive drugs, so we'll discuss that later. I know some people still like to argue that weed is an addictive drug. I'm not sure if that's where you fall, but
uh, I definitely don't
there's
think
no
it's addictive.
there's no chemical dependency
Yeah.
that you can
You
draw from
can
marijuana.
you can become addicted to anything, really. So
Right.
it's really a discussion about what addiction is, you know,
Right.
because
I
so
think there's a line between the chemical dependency
yeah.
and a person's addictive personality,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
So, so I admit, that there is an issue with crime when it comes to chemically dependent drugs, but we'll put that aside for the moment, and deal with the fact that with weed, because that's not a concern, pretty much all of the crime comes to the dealing and people dealing to kids and anybody that's willing to bring them money, and then also people trying to protect the revenue stream. And legalizing eliminates both of those crime routes. It takes the money away from the people doing it illegally. It takes I guess the profit incentive away, and you can still punish those crimes without punishing the law-abiding citizens that aren't hurting anybody. For me, it unless there is a victim, it can't be a crime. I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
I guess somebody would have to challenge me on that, but I don't see how you could have a crime without a victim.
I
And I
can't think
don't,
of anything.
yeah, and I don't think the government counts as a victim. I guess someone might say that not paying your taxes, but there is a victim there. Everybody else that is paying their taxes now has to pay a little more to cover you. So it's not really the government that's a victim, it's everybody else that's paying into the system that you're trying to avoid, but using the benefits of. And at the same time, does that mean you should go to jail? Not necessarily, but it should mean that you don't get to participate in whatever the benefits of those taxes are, whether it's the roads or healthcare or whatever. Sorry, I'm going off on I'm thinking this through in my head because
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's a lofty statement to say it can't be a crime without a victim, but I can't think of any way to counter that, at least myself. But so legalization deals with that problem when it comes to marijuana, and it did. I believed at the time, and just to give some round numbers for people to understand, weed illegally, right? Let's say the year before it was legalized, you could get a gram was anywhere from $7 to $10. It was really $10 was the standard, and then if you bought more, you could get. I'm trying to remember. An ounce would have been $280 at $10 a gram, but you could get an ounce for more like 200, maybe 150 on a really good day. And then it just, the price was pretty much 50 cents a gram if you got anything over an ounce, if I remember correctly. And there wasn't a whole lot of uh, what do they call it? The honey oil and the wax,
Mm-hmm.
um, and those sorts of things. It did exist, but mostly it was people making it themselves. Which there's some argument there. In fact, before I moved into the house that I'm in, I know the neighbors that lived directly across the street. About 5 years before I moved in here, they blew their house up trying to make wax or honey oil or whatever it
Oh.
was because it requires a lot of butane.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess they blew out all the windows and uh, were doing the mad scramble before the cops showed up. Unfortunately for them, these houses are only like 2 blocks from the police station, so they
Oh.
didn't get very far. But that was I don't want to say that was extremely common, but it wasn't an unheard of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it happened across the street from me. Probably most people that were familiar with the drug trade at the time could tell you about somebody that either hurt themselves or blew up their house or garage or whatever from trying to do that stuff themselves. And I would say that the the proliferation, because that's another argument that comes up, is well, so many more people smoke weed now that it's legal, but that's really not true. Um, there was a wide range. There was a lot of old people that smoked when it was illegal. In fact, one of the people that I bought from in high school was a little old lady that lived out on the beach. I had to drive quite a ways to
Mm-hmm.
get to her, but she was such a sweet old lady. I did it
Wow.
sometimes because I liked her.
Yeah.
And she had been robbed and like held, kidnapped in her home at gunpoint for people trying to steal her weed before and all kinds of crazy stuff. But she was just a sweet old lady that liked smoking weed and had a good connection,
Yeah.
apparently. And like I said, it feels like it's hard to say because right as it kind of became legal and stuff is right when I transitioned into being old enough. Thank you. But I think it was definitely easier then to buy weed underage because no drug dealer that I contacted ever asked for my ID, you know?
Yeah.
And while sure a kid could probably fairly easily find a tweaker or something to go buy him some weed from the weed store for $20,
Mm-hmm.
it's still it's the that's still a little more complicated than being able to just go and do it yourself, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So I would venture to guess that it's a little bit more difficult. I won't say it's matter of fact, we can just say it's a draw, I think. It's probably about the same.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's any benefit there. And what I was originally getting to was that the price was around $10 a gram before that, and what I believed was because of all the taxes and the incredibly difficult laws that they were placing on selling weed legally, I figured we'd still be buying it illegally for quite a while because it was just going to be way cheaper to do it outside of the law. When you have a dealer that doesn't pay any taxes versus a store that's trying to follow the law and paying 30% tax or whatever, it's a very high tax on weed.
Mm-hmm.
How are you ever going to have an equally cheap product? But I was wrong about that. I remember the first time I went into the first store, obviously pretty much right after it opened just to check it out, but I didn't buy anything. But the first time I went there to buy something was like 6 months in, and they were having a Christmas sale. And at the time, there wasn't a big variety because there was only so many suppliers and stuff at that time
Yeah.
that had gotten up and running. But it was only $5 a gram.
Hmm.
And so it was half the price only 6 months in from what it was illegally. And there's no, you don't have to buy an ounce to get $5 a gram. You can buy 1 gram if you want to. And I remember being pretty shocked by that. And at that point, that was about the time I was kind of growing out of caring about it anymore and not smoking anymore and all of that. But it took less than a year for the price to pretty consistently fall below the illegal market. And the illegal market was wiped out pretty much by the end of that first year. There was a few people that were really entrenched. Maybe they grew their own stuff, and so they were able to really sell at a big discount or whatever to match the stores that might have stuck around a little longer. But in general, I would say pretty much the entire black market was wiped out by the end of that first year. And that's kind of why I've come to the conclusion that I have. That's a big part of it for
Mm-hmm.
sure. To where now there's literally 2 pot stores within 2 blocks of my house, but that's kind of a coincidence. It's just it just happens to be where they both are. There's 3 on this side of my town total. There's pretty much one within, let's say, a mile of anywhere you're at. So they are pretty prolific. Yeah, about the same as a liquor store, which ironically we don't have anymore. But what do you mind saying what state you're in?
Oklahoma.
Oklahoma. Do you guys have liquor stores, or is alcohol just sold at like grocery stores and stuff?
It just recently became the way we have liquor stores still, but they just now started letting it be sold at gas stations and grocery stores and stuff.
Okay. Here there's, as far as I understood it before, they got rid of the liquor stores because they were basically state liquor stores. They weren't run by the state, but they were so heavily regulated that it was essentially a state liquor store. and then that changed where they could sell liquor in grocery stores and anywhere else, but you couldn't actually have, ironically, for whatever reason, you couldn't actually have just a liquor store. But gas stations still could only sell like wine and beer and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I did notice the other day, I went into a gas station and they had the little shots of Fireball.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's like an exception for small
Yeah.
amounts or something,
Because
but
I feel like before this law, they always had those. So I don't. I guess it's the amount of it. I don't know.
yeah, it might be the amount. And I've never been a drinker. I don't particularly pay attention to alcohol, so I don't know what the repercussions of those changes were necessarily. I mean, it was never illegal. It was
Mm-hmm.
one type illegal to a different type. I know it's far more expensive now than it was before. In fact, I think we have some of the highest alcohol prices in the state. To get the cheapest fifth of vodka is going to cost you probably $22 here. The
Dang.
price of the vodka itself is only $7 to $10, but the
Mm-hmm.
tax on it is so incredibly high that it's about double whatever the sticker price is. But and that is one thing I think that is really annoying about sales tax. I think sales tax are the way to go, but it's
Mm.
really annoying that you can't just see the price of something,
Yeah.
especially when the tax is that high on that particular object.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I digress. So the only real arguments against the legalization of weed, I think that the legalization really proved that maybe it didn't reduce the amount of kids that had access to it, but it definitely didn't make it worse. I don't see that. And the stats don't really bear that out. The studies that I've seen that claim that it made it worse, more accessible to kids, they don't seem to be on, they don't seem to have solid reasoning behind it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't want to get too heavy into citing a bunch of things and all that because I feel like that's unfair to do to guess. But I've never seen one in particular that it was usually pretty clearly BS. Because there
Yeah.
are some people I know when I was working in North Dakota, I went and worked in the oil fields for a while, and ultimately what got me fired was because when you worked over there, pretty much everybody, your apartment or whatever was paid for by your company. And I had a
Mm-hmm.
friend that came and visited me from here, and they smoked weed in the bathroom of my company apartment. And somebody that I worked with found out and told the bosses, and I got fired for that
Wow.
because and I can't blame them for that. It's my fault, right?
Yeah.
But I remember it striking me because to them that was like letting somebody do heroin in my apartment.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Weed was just in North Dakota, and I know in a lot of East Coast states, weed is the same drug as fentanyl in their mind. Maybe not fentanyl, but at least heroin. Is that what it's like in Oklahoma, or has it kind of changed since some states have legalized? Or
Yeah. We got medical. Uh, I don't know when that was, but it was. I
I'll
think
see
it
if I
was.
can pull
It
it
may
up.
have been when I was in high school. But we had that legalized, and it was only like 2 years ago. Um, we sent recreational to be voted on, and it failed.
Okay.
But I mean, the amount of people around here that smoke weed is pretty high, and I'm one of them.
Fair enough.
So I did,
2018 when you guys passed
okay,
medical,
that was
according to
after high
Rock.
school then.
And that was I did forget to mention it was legal medically here before we legalized, but only
Mm-hmm.
for a few years. And it was kind of a joke too, as far as I could have gone to a medical licensor, a doctor essentially, and given
Yeah.
them $20 and gotten my license.
Oh yeah, it's really
Um,
expensive now. It's like $200.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah. They've fully like industrialized it. Like there's companies that like that's their job is they do it for like all the medical states and stuff. So I think
Oh,
it,
okay,
it could
that
be
makes sense.
cheaper if you like actually went to a doctor, but to just do it the most painless, easiest way on your phone, you pay for it and then they literally do a video call with you. What's
Okay,
your
so it's
thing? So
convenience really
yeah.
that they're selling.
Hmm.
That's interesting. Um,
But
but see, and
the application fee for the license for the state is like $100, and then they charge you $100 to do that convenience thing. So it's around 200.
okay, it was probably somewhat similar. I think it was like $50 for the application fee, but this was also 20 years ago too.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it was like a $35 fee from the doctor or something. So all in all, and you spent $100, you could get your medical license. What
Yeah.
was more difficult about it was they were extremely stringent on the medical um, sellers. So there wasn't a store in every town. I would have had to have probably driven an hour to go to the only medical store in the area. And then it was fairly cheap and stuff because it wasn't heavily taxed, but it was definitely much more difficult. And then you had to keep your card with you anywhere you had weed, and there were severe uh, limits to how much you could have and all of
Mm-hmm.
that. It was very closely monitored, kind of like opioid prescriptions are now.
Yeah.
And I never found that system particularly useful or effective in any way. And ultimately, because of all that stringency, I know that the main person that I was buying weed from on the black market, he was getting supplied by one of the medical growers, and they would just they would sell a small amount to the medical dispensary, and then they'd sell the rest of it illegally, because who's to say how much weed grew on the vine. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not like you can ever really it's not like making a drug where if you buy 500 pounds of this and 500 pounds of this, you're going to get 1,000 pounds of the drug. It's very subjective how much you might get in from one crop to another. So there's no way to really say, to look at it on paper and go, well, they have this many plants, but they seem to only be producing this tiny amount. There's no way to do that,
Mm-hmm.
at least not when it comes to the law. You could probably look at it and go, yeah, they're probably selling under the table, but can you prove it?
Yeah.
But the other, the other big argument that people make against it, you have the use with kids, but I don't think that's gone up at all. Um,
Yeah.
and then the
And
other big argument that people make is that uh, the rest of our drug problem in this state, because Washington is fairly well known, kind of like San Francisco and much of California, of having a very large homelessness problem, a very large drug addict problem in
yep.
general. Like I said, this town is particularly high, but it's always been high long before any of this stuff happened, since about the 1970s, because that's when the logging industry was killed. So there's no future in this town.
Ah.
And because we're kind of in a remote area, out in the middle of the woods, it's not as easy to just get out of here for poorer families and stuff, because it's a
Mm-hmm.
long distance you got to move. Um, it's not like just moving to the next town over. That in this area, all of the towns, all of the closest towns, even if it's 2 hours away, they were a logging town too. They're just as bad off as we are.
Yeah.
And so that's really driven the drug problem here, I think, higher than just the state itself. But there is no question that with the legalization of marijuana, we saw a nearly identical rise with homelessness and with more drug addicts, and drug addicts from I mean, it's kind of one in the same, homeless and drug addicts. If if a person is addicted to opiates and they're not on the street, they're gonna be. Um,
Yep.
at least in 9 out of 10 cases, let's say. It obviously there are exceptions to the rule, but the rules are pretty steadfast. Um, so I'm just gonna use the term homeless rather than go back and forth. But there were homeless people coming from all over the country to come here. And the argument is, well, you made weed legal, and that's why they did that. And in a sense, that is true. But that's not the only reason. There are a lot of reasons why our homelessness problem exploded. And it did align with the legalizing of marijuana, but I don't know. I don't think the problem would have gotten nearly as bad as it did, even if we hadn't legalized marijuana. Obviously, if you're living on the street and you're doing illegal drugs, if you're harder drugs like heroin or meth or whatever, but you also smoke weed, you might as well go somewhere where it's legal, I guess. But most people that are doing those hardcore drugs, they don't smoke weed anymore.
Mm-hmm.
They might occasionally, try and make some money by flipping some small amount or something, getting a couple grams from somebody and then selling it to some kids for a marked up price or whatever. But that's
Yep.
that's a really specific anecdote. That's not, or anecdote, not antidote. That's not like some common thing that happens. But otherwise, they're living on $10 to $20 a day, which is exactly how much their addiction
Yep.
costs. So they don't. It's not like they have extra money to come and buy weed. So I really don't think weed was the driver. I just think it happened to coincide with a lot of these other things, like decriminalization, which we'll get to. Is there any other arguments against states like Washington that have legalized it completely that you've heard that you think might have some weight, might be relevant?
Are we specifically talking about weed?
Yeah, about legalizing weed.
Yeah. The most common argument I hear is that weed causes psychosis.
Okay.
In schizophrenia. But as far as the stuff that I've looked at, and I don't have any sources on me or didn't prepare any, but the sources I've looked at shows that the rate of schizophrenics in the normal population and then the amount of schizophrenics that smoke weed is about the same. So it kind of shows that like they were going to have a schizophrenic break whether they used weed or not, but then also people who are mentally unstable and mentally unwell, have mental illnesses, are more likely to use drugs and really any substances because they want to escape reality, escape what's going on in their brain. So it's just going to be common for those type of people to use drugs. So we can't really use that argument, in my opinion. I don't think it causes
No,
that.
I agree, and I don't think I've ever seen, I've seen people freak out from smoking too much before, but it doesn't cause them to permanently lose their mind. They just freak out while they're high, and then they're fine. So I agree. From what I have seen and from what I experienced, like I said, I don't really smoke anymore, but I still know plenty of people that do and stuff. I can't think of a single person that I have known that developed psychosis or schizophrenia. I know some people that have just fried their brain, but they're not the same as a schizophrenic. They just are a little slower, a little, laughing at things that weren't necessarily said out loud, and
abuse of really any substance will do that to your brain. It doesn't matter which one it is.
Yeah, I mean, you take too many Tylenol, you're gonna die of kidney failure.
Yeah.
Which is something that I'm much more concerned about. But I apologize, I got a call coming in. I'm not sure where it's coming from. I think it might be a police officer actually that I was talking to about a bike that was stolen from my porch. Anyway, sorry, that's not interesting, but I was just getting distracted. But I had a stepbrother who was schizophrenic, and he didn't smoke weed or anything. There was definitely no relation to weed that caused it, and it's kind of, it's difficult to talk about because he's passed away now. He died because he was having an episode, and the police were trying to arrest him, and whatever he was seeing in his head they thought they were he thought they were trying to kill him or whatever, and so he tried to run away and ultimately ended up getting killed, not by the police officers. He like fell off a ledge or
Oh,
something.
I'm sorry to
I
hear
don't
that.
remember exactly at this point, but he did start smoking weed, you know, once he was on the street, basically. But he had long been not taking his medication, and his schizophrenia had long developed. So kind of like you said, the the rate of schizophrenic abuse of alcohol and drugs and stuff is pretty high because of what they're already dealing with. It's
Mm-hmm.
self-medicating, right?
Yeah.
And
Yep.
I do think that schizophrenia is on the rise, which helps give credibility to the argument. Well, so
Mm-hmm.
is the legalization of marijuana, but we don't know what causes schizophrenia, and it was rising long before marijuana was legalizing.
Yeah.
And having seen it in stuff, having seen, being intimately familiar with different people's reactions to smoking weed, and being pretty familiar with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia has always scared the shit out of me because
Mm-hmm.
for guys especially, it just happens, and there's really
Yeah.
nothing that tells you it's going to happen. And
Mm-hmm.
so my whole 20s, because that's when it's most likely to
Yeah.
happen, I believe, is in your 20s.
Yeah, like 18
Uh,
to 25 or something around there.
yeah, something like that. And so that whole time, it was always in the back of my mind, at seeing my stepbrother growing up, that was a possibility.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, and see, that's another interesting thing. For whatever reason, it just doesn't affect women. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
not that there's no schizophrenic women, but
Yeah.
it's a tiny amount compared to the amount of men. And so, you know, there's not much difference in the amount of women versus men that smoke weed. So there's no correlation there
Mm-hmm.
either.
That's a
And you
good
would think
point.
there would be.
Yeah.
And honestly, I've seen far more women freak out from smoking weed just from,
Yeah.
being too high or whatever than I've seen men. So you would think that would, it's all anecdotal, but at the end of the day, that's kind of all we have too. But I've heard that one, and then another argument that I've heard and that I've seen is that DUIs are much higher now,
Yeah. That was talked about
and
on
that
Joe
is,
Rogan episode.
was it?
Yeah. It was a long time ago. And Joe Rogan just like wouldn't let it up. It was kind of funny if you go look up that clip, but anyways.
Was he was probably defending it, yeah.
Yeah, he was defending it, and one guy was saying it was because he was referencing his own article that he wrote. Joe Rogan kind of discredited it, and he was like, "But it was real numbers that I used." He said, like Colorado legalized weed, and then almost immediately after, traffic incidents went up, and so Joe Rogan was just like, "Well, it just happens to be that people are smoking weed, and they get in a crash. The weed didn't cause it."
Yeah. Yeah, and it a lot of people don't like saying it. I drove many times high.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the same thing as drunk. There were times
Yeah.
where I was too high to drive, and I definitely shouldn't have, and I didn't because I wouldn't get off the
Yeah.
couch either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I used to be an
But
alcoholic, and I had my times of driving drunk, and I'm lucky I never got caught.
yeah,
But I
well,
also kind of like,
that
I mean, I
nobody got
knew a
hurt.
limit where, I wouldn't drive after an entire night of drinking most times, uh, unless I had given myself like an hour or two. Like, I'm going to leave in an hour or two, so I'm just going to done drink. Um,
Yeah,
but most of the time that I was drinking and driving, it would be like a beer or two, maybe three, which I'm a big guy. I'm 6'4", 200 pounds. So 2 or 3 beers isn't much,
no, not at all.
especially for an alcoholic.
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean, 2 or 3 beers is what my old co-host Timmy used to drink to stay hydrated.
Wow.
um, it amazed me the amount of beer that guy could put back, but his dad was the
Mm-hmm.
same way. And
Yep.
it pretty much, unless he drank hard liquor, he couldn't drink beer fast enough to get drunk. I mean, he was
Mm.
intoxicated, don't get me wrong, but he
Yeah.
wasn't drunk.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always had a really fast metabolism. I'm kind of a slim guy,
Yeah.
and with alcohol specifically, my metabolism it just processes it really fast. So I can get fairly drunk off of a fairly small amount, but it only lasts about an hour too.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that there's no effects after an hour, but after an hour, I'm nearly as competent as I was before I started drinking. It's always been, and that's part of the reason why I don't like drinking because I don't care for the taste, and I always had to consume
Yeah.
a lot consistently in order to stay drunk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why they invented beer. So you could just drink them, and it's
Just
such
keep
a
it
low
going.
alcohol content. You kind of keep that. You can kind of keep that buzz going. It's great for being on the lake or whatever.
And I do enjoy a beer now. When I was younger, I didn't care for it, and
Mm,
maybe I just didn't like the taste of Bud Light because that's
yeah,
kids just buy whatever's cheap. But
yeah. I really like
uh,
whiskey. I don't care much for beer. I would drink it, but now I wouldn't. If I'm gonna drink, it'd be like whiskey, bourbon.
I pretty much I'll have a beer on a hot day or whatever if we're
Mm-hmm.
barbecuing and there's a beer I like, I'll have one.
Yeah.
But that's because I like the taste a little bit more now.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of one of those things that it's summertime, I'm gonna have a beer.
Yeah. Yeah. Nothing wrong with
But
that.
I don't think there's a I've never really had I don't think I've ever had good whiskey before, so I can't say that I wouldn't like it
Mm-hmm.
now. It's just one of those things, your taste buds change as you get older. I like
Yeah.
coffee now. I didn't like it when I was little.
Mm-hmm.
My son, oh god, my son loves coffee for some reason. I
Mm-hmm.
don't understand why, but he is always begging for coffee, and his freaking grandparents always give it to him. Like,
Wow.
knock it off. It's not that a small cup of drip coffee is really that big of a deal at 9 years old, but if you let him, he would drink the whole pot.
Mm-hmm.
What kid likes drip coffee? I get a kid liking a 6,000 calorie Starbucks drink because it's
Mm-hmm.
got a ton of sweetener and stuff in it, but I have never met a kid that likes drip coffee with no cream, no sugar.
Yeah, I used to drink my coffee with sugar, but now I pretty much black.
I like a little cream. I'm not big on the super sweet, but I do like a little cream.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, the as far as the DUI stuff, the other the other compounding factor here is the fact that marijuana stays in your system for so long. And especially early on, the tests have gotten better at being able to determine, are you actually under the influence right now or did you smoke last week? The
Yeah.
more body fat that you have, the longer the test will stay in your system. I've known some people that will fail a piss test for THC, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, after smoking one time.
Mm.
And for me, it's not that way. For me, it's only a couple days. But if I was smoking consistently every single day, it would probably be at least 2 weeks before it's out of my system. And uh, the early test that they had for weed, they could only determine that there was THC in your system, and there was really no way to determine, is this a high enough level uh, to be intoxicated. And as much as alcohol is subjective based on how much you drink and your weight and your height and your metabolism and all of that, weed is even more subjective. One person might be able to smoke 5 grams one joint after another and be
Mm-hmm.
relatively the same amount high, whereas another person might finish one joint and
Yeah.
be out of their mind crazy.
Mm-hmm. There is a
Crazy
little
is
bit
not
of
the
a
right word.
tolerance still to weed if you're doing it daily.
Yeah, yeah. When I was smoking daily, I would smoke a whole joint in order
Mm-hmm.
to relax. Whereas now I could probably take a puff or two, and I
Yeah.
do occasionally, and
Yeah.
it's the same feeling.
Mm-hmm. That's why I keep myself at that level. I rarely, like, if I'm hanging out with friends, will smoke like a lot, like binge kind of. But for the most part, I keep it like at a pretty low level because I know that tolerance will just kind of sit there if you let it, and then take some time off, like a day or two every once in a while.
Sure. Yeah, and that is something that I noticed back when I did smoke a lot in high school and stuff, and there's been a few times too. You know, I'm over 30 now. There's been a couple times in my life where I've smoked for a couple months or whatever, just because I felt like it, or
Mm-hmm.
you know, was under stress or whatever it was. You could probably point to something in my life that made me choose to start smoking again for a period of time. But
Mm-hmm.
at some point, it stopped becoming fun. And actually, I know exactly when it stopped becoming fun. Do you have kids? Do you mind
Not
saying?
yet. I've been married for a year and a half now.
Right on.
So
Congratulations.
no kids yet. Thank you.
It that is when smoking stopped becoming fun to me, and the
Mm-hmm.
reason is because my son, when they're a baby and stuff, you're always listening at night for them crying, and you're always waking up because they're crying. Well, when you smoke, occasionally it's not that you hear things, but
Mm-hmm.
you can definitely talk yourself into a little
Oh yeah.
paranoia in your head back and forth.
Yeah.
And it got to the point where it's like, am I hearing him crying? No, I'm not hearing him crying. Is
Mm-hmm.
he crying? I can't tell. And that's when it became no fun anymore, because it was just like, I need to be fully here for this. And it got to the point where like it was almost torture because I didn't feel like I could fall asleep comfortably and know, okay, he's crying, I need to get up and go check on it. But we as far as the DUIs, you have the issue of not being able to determine how much. And then also you have the fact in Washington, at least, I can't speak for Colorado, but the reason that the number of DUIs went up in Washington is really simple, and it has nothing to do. I mean, it has everything to do with legalizing, but it's not because more people started smoking. It's because before it was legal, there was no DUI for weed.
Mm-hmm.
Even if a cop caught you smoking a joint while driving down the freeway, pretty much no cop would arrest you for that. You could technically get a DUI for it, but again, weed doesn't really affect you driving. So the rule with weed prior to the legalization was whether your driving was okay or not. And if you were getting pulled over while stoned, your driving usually wasn't the reason why. You might have been speeding a little bit or whatever,
Yeah.
because you typically drive that way, but it wasn't because you were swerving across lanes or not stopping at stop signs or whatever. The worst thing I ever did was I stopped for a red light one block before the red light. I pulled right up to the crosswalk, right to the stoplight, or the stop line, like I was supposed
Mm-hmm.
to, and all of that. And then the light turned green, and I looked up, and I was like, "Oh shit, that light's up there. It's not right here."
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
thankfully, nobody saw it. But
Yeah. I had this one time. Me and my friend were driving home, and he was riding with me, and we had gotten pretty high. And this is when I was still like new to weed, so it was like pretty high. And we were driving down the interstate, and we both just kept abrupting in the loudest laughter because we would look over at my speedometer, and I had the cruise set to like 60 miles an hour and the speed limit was like 65. And we would just both be like, it feels like we're just going so slow, dude. And then I just looked down and we were still going the same speed.
that actually, now that you said that, there was one other time too, and it was the first time I ever smoked weed. And we spent probably 3 hours that night trying to get stoned. And for whatever reason, I decided to drive. The town that I live in, there's kind of two towns butted up to each other, and unless you live here, you don't even realize it's two different towns because it's
Mm-hmm.
there's no dividing line or anything. And so I was living in the opposite town that I'm in now, and I drove over here because this is where I had previously lived. There was a little area in the woods that I knew, a little private area, and we were determined we're going to smoke weed and get high tonight. I was probably 15.
Mm-hmm.
No, I had to have been 16 because I was driving my own car. And we smoked. I remember I bought $20 worth, but it was about 4 grams that I got because it was a friend of mine. And we smoked almost all of that and didn't get high at all. My guess is we weren't actually inhaling because we didn't know what the hell we were doing.
Mm-hmm.
But finally, a friend of mine who did smoke weed, just it's actually the person that Timmy. I'm pretty sure they're gonna get married. They're not engaged yet, but I'm pretty sure it's coming. It's ironically it's the person that he's with now, but she came over because I told her that we had some weed if she wanted to come smoke, and it was probably one hit once she showed us the correct way to do it because I'd never smoked out of a pipe before and all of that. And I remember we drove to 7-Eleven, which was half a mile away. She drove us over there, and I didn't feel anything. I didn't feel anything. And then the next thing I remember, I was standing in line, and I looked up and realized that I was at the counter, and the person was waiting for me to hand them money. And I looked down in my hand, and I realized that there was a weed nug in my hand and a $10 bill, and the person was just standing there staring at me, and I just took the money out of my hand and handed it to my friend and walked out of the store. And I didn't realize the whole time I was on the phone too. When I walked out of the store, I realized I was on the phone. I'm like, I don't know who this is, but I gotta go. And she drove us back over to my car, and we stayed there for a little bit, but it was getting close to my curfew at the time. So I had no choice but to drive home. And on that drive home, thankfully there was nobody on the road or anything. It was, it was late at night. There was nothing at all. But I remember that every time I looked down at the speedometer, I was going slower.
Yeah.
And I felt like I was going faster and faster and faster, but every time I looked down, I was going slower. And so I had to ultimately set my cruise control because I was afraid I was going to get pulled over for going 5 and a 30.
Yep.
And I made it home somehow. That was the only time that I truly shouldn't have drove, but I did. But that was partially because of my curfew. I felt like I had no choice.
Yep.
And it hadn't, it hadn't really, I guess I didn't notice until it's too late kind of thing,
Yeah.
Just like standing in the store like that, I didn't even notice that it had hit me until I was holding weed in my hand in front of the cashier. Like, what am I in the middle of doing right now?
Yep.
But yeah, and so prior to the law, as long as your driving was fine, they couldn't give you a DUI just because they knew you had smoked.
Yeah.
But with the law change, because that was one of the concerns, was dealing with DUI. Now they set an actual blood limit, and there was an actual charge for driving under the influence of marijuana and stuff. So basically, there was no charge for it before. So that's why DUIs for marijuana went up after the law, because now there was a law for it. And early on, because they didn't have a good way to test it and stuff, a lot of people ended up getting screwed with DUIs who hadn't even smoked. Now, their driving must have been bad in some way in order to get pulled over, although not necessarily. Sometimes cops are just dicks and they smell weed in the car, so that's good enough. But that usually depends on your attitude too. Boy, that took me way too long to learn.
Yeah.
I had 19 tickets by the time I was 20 years old, and I probably could have only had 2 or 3. Never for speeding. I never got a single speeding ticket till I was 25. But I had 19 tickets, and I probably could have gotten out of pretty much all but 3 had I just been not a dick. But I was, 16, 17, 18. I knew everything, so.
Yeah. I got every speeding ticket that I've should have gotten, except for one, and then that's when I quit speeding altogether. The only other ticket I got was for my tag light being out, because I was driving home and I live way out in the country. I had a big light bar on top of my truck, and it was kind of like a dark night, no moon out and everything. So I had that light bar on, just driving out in the country, come up over this hill at this intersection, and the cop's sitting there. Well, it's illegal to have that type of light on unless you're off road or it's foggy. So he pulls me over, and then doesn't give me a ticket for any of that. He gives me a ticket because one of my tag lights is out. So, but then I just went to the court case and told the judge, and he was just like, "Did you get your tag light fixed?" And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "All right, I trust you, son." And he's like, "Just go downstairs and pay your court fees, like $5, $10 or something." So
That's not bad.
only
Court
got one
fees are
speeding
definitely a
ticket.
lot more in Washington. That's good. And see, that's usually what it was for me. And it was really because I was being a dick, where, I knew I got pulled over for no reason. And part of that was
Mm-hmm.
because I drove Hondas. I had one that had like 5% tint. And at the time, tint was completely illegal in Washington, over 20% or something.
Yeah.
Um, it didn't matter what window it was on or whatever. Over 20% was just completely illegal. And, and one of the Hondas I owned, it wasn't tinted, but it was loud as shit. I mean, it was just, an irritating teenager's car.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got pulled over a lot because of that. And that every time I got pulled over, that increased my anger a little bit, or
Mm-hmm.
frustration at it. And so then I was more of a dick. And then they would always find something to give me a ticket for. And one day I realized, I think it was because I had a girlfriend in the car, and the cop came up and did his thing, and then walked away with my license and stuff. And she's like, "Why are you being such a dick?" And honestly, at that point, I didn't even really realize that
Yeah.
I was. It was
Mm-hmm.
just the instant frustration that came over me, and I was like, honestly, I don't know. And after that, I pretty much never got a ticket. I got one for expired tabs at one point and stuff, but those were
Yeah.
things that I was actually doing wrong, so it didn't make me mad. But that, and I lived in a small town, and so once you piss off, a particular cop or a couple cops in a small town, well, every
Yep.
time they see you, they're gonna light you up, and they did
Mm-hmm.
a lot. But anyway, as far as my state, and I imagine Colorado is probably similar, and that's why there's an increase there. The
Yeah.
correlation with DUI is, there maybe is a correlation there, but you can't prove it with this data because there was no data before that. So we don't know what it was like before it was legal. And
Mm-hmm.
like I said, there's really been no change in the amount of people that smoke. There might be, there might be a few people that didn't smoke before because they they were they wouldn't buy it illegally. And so
Yeah.
now they might try a joint on New Year's Eve or whatever that they wouldn't have otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not it, there's not a big change in the number of
Yeah. It's not like a
marijuana
drastic
smokers.
increase.
Right.
It's probably a
The people doing
small
it
percentage,
consistently.
but yeah, the definitely like there'd be probably a spike of like people who tried it, and then the same amount of people who try alcohol or cigarettes or whatever, they're gonna be like, it's not for me, you know. So
Yeah.
the long term, it's probably just gonna be a very small percentage.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's increased a tiny bit. Maybe it's decreased a tiny bit. I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
but it's definitely not noticeably changed on the ground here.
Yeah, I see what
And
you're
then the
saying.
other thing is, you know, how many people were willing to admit it before it was legal? And so your
Yeah.
numbers are artificially low.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have said I was smoking weed
Nope.
unless I knew you smoked weed too, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I, I have yet to see where it has caused provable and tangible harm from legalizing it. But I do see where it is provably and tangibly uh, bettered bettered things, because you don't have any crime whatsoever associated with weed anymore. You just don't,
Yeah.
other than I guess DUIs.
Mm-hmm.
But again, there's really been no change in that, so it's irrelevant. Um, and it's hard to say, but the gateway argument that you know weed is a gateway drug, that really comes down to the kind of like the addictive personality thing. It's only a
Yeah.
gateway drug if you're looking for ways to get high.
Mm-hmm.
In which case, yeah, you'll probably start with weed. But if weed didn't exist, you'll probably start with something else.
Yeah.
It's no more or less a gateway than alcohol is.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad that this conversation has gone the way it has, because I'm sure there are a lot of conservatives that are going to hear this and they're going to be pissed because weed is
Yeah.
no different than meth or heroin to them, and it's just not the case.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's been demonized.
I would probably feel exactly the same way if I grew up somewhere where it was treated that way. But because I've grown up in a much more this state was very libertarian until about the last 8 years. Um, and so it's not really the progressivism that made weed acceptable. It was the libertarianism before that.
Mm.
But um, but because I've grown up in that and I've seen it, it's definitely given me a different perspective on it.
Yeah.
I would much rather see marijuana be legalized and alcohol be illegal than the
Mm-hmm.
other way around. And I don't think
Yes.
either should be illegal, but
Yeah.
I think that there is provably far more harm that comes from alcohol.
Oh yeah. Provably. Uh, and alcohol is the number one drug used by rapists. So
Is it?
yeah,
I didn't know that.
it
And that's not to say
because
that if you drink, you're going to become a rapist either.
yeah, people use it to make women, most young women like who have sex at a young age, their first sexual experience is when they're drunk. So
Right. Okay, I see what you're saying. So as
yeah,
far as like date rape, drugs, and
it may not
alcohol is a good
be particularly like rape, but I'm talking about like they're using it to coerce people into making decisions they wouldn't have made if they weren't drunk.
Sure. Let's say used by predators rather than necessarily just rapists.
Mm-hmm.
And there definitely are, those type of guys out there that are angry generally for whatever reason, and
Yeah.
they feel scorned by women or whatever it is, and they wouldn't necessarily go out and snatch a woman off the street, but they will use dirty tactics to gain coercion.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
That'll definitely be. And see, part of the problem with that is because progressives went so far into treating those as the same thing, where you have, serial rapists that are violently hurting people versus, guys that are doing inappropriate things, but you can't necessarily call it rape. And then also conflating that with innocent things where, both the guy and the girl are drunk and maybe one or both regret it the next day, but the guy is
Mm-hmm.
always at fault.
Yeah.
Even though they were both intoxicated.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
If you both can't consent, then it's a draw. You can't make one person always responsible. Especially if you're going to give women equal rights. I mean, if you want to take away all the women's rights, sure, it's always the guy's fault, but I don't think that's the road we want to go down.
Yeah.
Certainly not the road I want to go down, but because of progressives' desire to conflate all of those things, it's really made it difficult to address that predatory behavior, because I have to sit here and defend and go, no, hold on, that's not the same thing as hurting children or, snapping a woman off the street and beating her in until she's unconscious and then raping her. That's two different things. Like, and because of that, because of having to sort those things out, we never get to the conversation of, yes, this behavior is bad, and yes, we do need to address it, but it needs to be addressed differently. And it's generally not illegal. It's bad behavior, but it's not necessarily illegal behavior. If you get somebody's consent, even if it's through manipulation, there's no law that's broken there. Generally speaking. I mean, obviously, if you drug somebody, that's different. But if you sit there and have a bunch of drinks with a woman with the intent of hoping that she'll, lower her ambitions enough when you're both drunk enough, there's no law broken there, but it is a behavior that a guy shouldn't be portraying, let's say.
Yeah, and that comes to an individual thing, not
and that's
not something the government should be involved in.
Exactly. That's a problem that's solved in better parenting.
Yes. The smallest form of government is the family.
Absolutely. And I very much I'm a bottom up government type person
Yep.
where it's yourself or God, yourself, family, and then your neighbors, and then your city,
Mm-hmm.
your state, and then your federal.
Yep.
Whereas everything is kind of upside down right now, where it's top
Yes.
down, and I think that is a huge part of the problem.
Yeah. That's my main voice in the political scene is we need to take things down a notch. Like I think the first step with drug legalization is to get the federal government's hand out of it, which we're kind of starting that step by legalizing it in the states, but still federally, technically the FBI can come and arrest you for having weed no matter how legal it is in your state. So, or whoever
That's
does
true.
that type of
Yeah.
arresting, DEA, whatever.
Yeah, I would imagine it's DEA. I imagine ATF probably manipulates those laws a lot because they do all kinds of shady stuff to
Mm-hmm.
make their cases. ATF is probably one of, well, there's no question FBI is the worst, but ATF is probably right there behind them
Oh
in
yeah.
manipulating laws and constitution to make their cases.
Mm-hmm.
We covered one not too long ago that was, I think it was joint FBI and ATF, where it had to do with the I forget what they call it, but where they essentially just steal people's money.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I think I listened to your episode on
Um,
that.
yeah, there's a specific word for it, and I can't remember what it is. But in this case, they they had a private bank, and it wasn't a bank; it was just like a private safety deposit company, and they were able to prove that 4 of the safety deposit boxes were being used for crime, and for whatever reason, a judge granted them the ability to take all of the safety deposit boxes in the bank, even though it had nothing to do with those 4 that were being used for crime. And they just stole all of that money and refused to give it back to the legal owners, even though they had absolutely no crime that they were charging those legal owners with. And there was nothing illegal that bank was doing. They had no idea those boxes were being used for crime.
Mm-hmm.
They just had an anonymous system. Um, and so this was going to court. And what ended up happening was it went to a high enough judge where the judge was like, no, you guys can't do this. You need to give this shit back. And the FBI, they didn't want that decision to come down because
Mm-hmm.
that would affect all of these other times they had done that. And so
Yeah.
they basically wrote a letter to the judge saying, hey, yeah, we'll give the stuff back, but please don't say that we did anything wrong here, or we're gonna have to give a whole lot of stuff back that we stole elsewhere. And there, I mean, obviously it was a little more coded than that, but that was pretty much blatantly what the FBI was arguing to the judge. Absolutely insane.
Yeah.
6. Okay. Just checking the time. So anyway, I think we've covered legalization pretty good. There's been a lot of benefit, and the other benefit to legalization too that I don't think we've touched, but is pretty brief, is there is unquestionably, no matter what the drug is, whether it's insulin or opiates or marijuana or
Mm-hmm.
even alcohol, there is a medicinal benefit to it for something.
Yes.
And for marijuana especially, there are a lot of medicinal benefits. I mean, for epilepsy, the
Mm-hmm.
CBDs in marijuana is night and day. It's
Yeah.
it's like the only thing that does something with no side effects whatsoever.
Yeah.
And the fact that that would be kept from kids. Go ahead.
I kind of know like, how that works. I didn't know if we wanted to explain that or if it was relevant to your point, but
Yeah, no, go
like
ahead.
how it works in the
I'd love to
brain
know.
to stop epilepsy.
Uh-huh.
So basically, like in your brain, you have these certain receptors that will intake the THC or CBD molecules. And so, what is happening during an epileptic seizure is those CBD receptors are like firing, and your brain kind of will produce its own CBD, a form of it that can bind to that receptor. So that's what's happening. And so whenever you use CBD and you have epilepsy, it kind of goes in there and sits on that receptor so that that thing that your brain made doesn't sit there and cause that epileptic seizure. I had a
So
friend
it's
who had
kind of tricking your
epilepsy.
brain into thinking it's been made already, so you
Mm-hmm.
don't need to.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that makes sense. Interesting. You said you had a friend that had
Yeah.
epilepsy.
Yeah. So I started looking into that uh, because he was trying to, like, his mom really didn't like weed at all, but he's like, it helps me, and he was always telling me, like, these doctors are giving me all these drugs and they don't really help, and he was like getting to the point where he was like, I'm afraid that one of these seizures is going to kill me. And so I was like, well, I'll look into it,
Right.
because I my first, like, job that I wanted to have was, I wanted to be a doctor. Like, I was a freshman in high school, and people started asking, well, what do you want to do after high school? And I was like, I want to be a doctor. So then by the time I got to a senior in high school, though, I was like, oh, I kind of just want to be like a nurse, or like, and so right after high school, I went to college and I got my EMT license. And so I've always kind of like had a background in the medical stuff, so it really interests me. I didn't end up going that way,
Okay.
obviously, because my Twitter name, the Friendly UPS Man. I do work for UPS,
Oh,
but
do you? Okay.
mhm.
I wasn't sure if that was just a joke or
Yeah, some people can't
whatnot.
figure it out, but I just kind of like it because I also use an AI photo that's not a real photo of me. So
I kind of figured.
some people call it out. Some people, I don't know. Some people will call me ugly, like, you're
Generally,
ugly, dude. And I'm like, oh, it's an AI photo.
I know. Whenever, anytime you back a leftist of any sort into a corner where uh, they can't argue with what you said logically, then they just immediately go to your profile and find whatever they get. I get told all the time because my profile says I'm a dad, so I get told all the time, I feel bad for your kids.
Yep.
I'm like, well, my kids seem to be doing all right, so go ahead, feel bad for them. But
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I don't know. It's funny. It's funny because it's predictable. But
Mm-hmm.
so
Very.
the did the CBD, did that take away your friend's seizures altogether, or did
Uh,
it reduce
um,
them? Or
I think he said he did because he smoked weed, and he said it helped, but then, like, his mom really wanted him to be on the, like, pharmaceutical drugs that they were giving him, but he said they didn't really help, or he had to
Ooh,
take a lot of them and they'd kind of just like knock him out, and not
yeah,
like where he could be functioning. He could smoke weed and function and do his job and everything, but
right.
I don't
Yeah,
talk to him anymore. So
I've I've worked a lot of jobs where everybody is high.
yeah.
um, the theory that weed makes you lazy. I mean, it can.
Mm,
If you're already lazy, it's
yes.
going to amplify that.
Mm-hmm.
But I've
That's what I
also
say.
worked with plenty of people that get up and go to work every day,
Yeah.
and they get high every day. I can't do it. It's taxing to do that. But
Mm-hmm. My own experiences, like, when I was an alcoholic, I was lazy, like, didn't clean the house, didn't get up and do things. I got up to like 260, maybe 270. I don't know. I wasn't weighing myself, but I was got pretty fat. And then once I dropped that alcohol, I mean, just that alcohol weight dropped. But then, like, when I started smoking weed, I've become so much more productive.
then maybe I should start drinking because I have the opposite problem. I can eat 5,000 calories a day and I cannot keep the weight on. It's crazy
Yeah.
because that ridiculously fast metabolism. It's also not great for my health,
Yeah.
but in the opposite sense. Um, it's funny because I get told all the time how lucky I am, and it's like
Mm-hmm.
there's disadvantages for not being able to keep the weight on either. It's nice that I don't have to change my clothes size all the time and stuff, but there's disadvantages here too,
Yeah.
like injuring my back, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so I think there's no question that there's benefit to it, and that anybody that is following, that is an otherwise good law-abiding citizen, that I just don't believe that there is a place for government to tell them what they can and
Yeah.
can't do. We create government to do
Mm-hmm.
a certain function for us. Government doesn't give us permission to do something.
Yeah.
Um, so fundamentally, there's no two ends there. And other people are not supposed to be able to use the government to stop other people from doing things that aren't harming them. You know, The government's job is to stop somebody from harming you. It is not to stop somebody else from doing something you don't like.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think it comes down to is some people just don't like that they're doing it. And so I usually say like, well, if you don't think you're going to have a problem doing it, then why would you want to restrict someone else from doing it, you know?
Exactly. And some people say, well, what if they get high and drive? Then it is my
Mm-hmm.
problem. But that's already illegal. And
Yeah.
I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have DUIs. If somebody is driving dangerously, that is what they are doing that is illegal. It's not the fact that they smoked, it's the fact
Yeah.
they got behind the wheel of a car.
Mm-hmm.
And that should be illegal. And that's why, so the next, of the three here, the next thing, which will be much easier to just discredit altogether, is decriminalization. And Washington State didn't decriminalize drug use, but Seattle and a lot of the surrounding areas did. And
Mm-hmm.
that has been an absolute disaster. They've actually, I don't think Seattle's actually reversed the policy yet, but basically everywhere else that did it with them reversed it. And the state was basically forced to step in and go, no, you can't impose this on all these places around you, and the state's still going to enforce some of these laws even if you're not going to. Kind of like the way sanctuary cities are operating. Some states are still, even if one city is declaring itself sanctuary, you still could get picked up by ICE.
Yeah.
Just like you were saying with the weed laws, it's still illegal federally, and a federal officer could technically arrest you if they wanted to. I'm not sure how I feel about that last one in particular, but state law. But that goes back to the bottom up thing. State laws are supposed to override federal as far as for you in the state. Regardless, decriminalization, I think, is the worst of both worlds because it doesn't stop the crime, it doesn't stop the dealing, it doesn't stop the criminal enterprise. All it does is take away any punishment for doing those awful things, and it doesn't stop the proliferation or anything else either. I mean, it's literally the worst of both worlds. And a lot of libertarians like to push for decriminalization because, well, it doesn't need to be legal, but the government should be punishing you. Yes, the government shouldn't be punishing you, but decriminalization doesn't allow business and or legitimate business to now take over the role that the black market businesses are in control of right now, and that really is a critical component to dealing with this problem, I think. And that's kind of getting to the fundamental part of the argument that I was making to you originally, which is part of the way that you deal with the deadliness of fentanyl, and the proliferation of it in particular, and with the massive addiction problem that comes with some of these drugs. I mean, we have to remember what started this in the first place. What started this was the massive proliferation of prescription medication. And then the government allowed that to happen, which I don't think they necessarily should have had any business with in the first place. But they allowed that to happen, and then they just pulled the rug to where now, if, no matter, you could have your kidney pulled out and they won't give you a Vicodin for it, or they'll give you two and say go take Tylenol. There are legitimate uses for this medication, and again, a law-abiding citizen shouldn't have any government should not be getting in the way of what a doctor thinks they should be using.
Yeah.
And frankly, that's another issue, is the doctor, and that's what I want to close with. So we'll get to that in a second. But as far as what created this problem, it was the going from completely okay and encouraged, and that's part of the problem, was the encouragement, because it was told that there's absolutely no consequence to taking this. Yeah. So it wasn't just that it was legal, it was that then you also had these companies that are legitimized by government institutions because the FDA is saying, yeah, we approved it, and they say it's non-addictive, and we agree, only because the drug company was paying off the FDA. And so people went, oh, well, if there's no downside, why wouldn't I take this drug that helps eliminate my pain and makes me feel great?
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't true. And people might have been more skeptical if you didn't have the government institutions giving the rubber stamp to it.
Yeah.
But um, but then you pull the rug out, and now all these people are chemically addicted to this substance, which is entirely different from the mental dependency of marijuana,
Mm-hmm.
or that you can get from marijuana. Um, and now they have to find it somewhere else. And this was the argument I really started with you, is now they have to find it somewhere else. The only option is the black market, unless you happen to be, a certified chemist or something. Um, then you have to go to the black market. And the reason I think we ended up with fentanyl, it's partially because I think China's trying to weaken our population any
Mm-hmm.
way they can, because
Yeah.
they're clearly preparing for something.
Yes.
And I think they really want to get back at Britain a little bit, and they see us as an analog for that, for the opiate wars back in the 1600s or whatever. Chinese
Mm-hmm.
memory is very long.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely a piece of that to this, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. But you know, at the same time, you can't be that mad because the demand is here for it. It's not
Mm-hmm.
as if they're shoving it down people's throats either. They're just making it available. And so because you now have to go to the illicit market, well, they have to smuggle those drugs into the country somehow or make them here, but that's generally more difficult
Mm-hmm.
because they can make them in safety in Mexico and then just smuggle them.
Yep.
And so when you're smuggling the drugs, obviously you're going to lose a lot to being seized. And so profit wise, it's just a straight profit motive.
Mm-hmm.
The more powerful the drug, the less of it you need to get across to make more money. And therefore, you want to make the drug as powerful as possible because it's easier to hide, it's easier to get a significant amount of it across, and you can sell it for more money once it's there. And so I think that's really, I don't know that we would have gone to fentanyl otherwise if heroin was still widely available.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, this was a decision more or less by the cartel, because the Chinese were offering them basically free fentanyl because they wanted to get it into America. And so they now have a really cheap supply of this other drug that's even better and it's more powerful. So we're just going to stop selling the heroin altogether. We're going to start selling the fentanyl because it's better profit motive for us for all of these different reasons. And so you couldn't buy heroin on the street now if you wanted to. It used to be, probably 10 years ago, that everybody on the street, if you were really, really had given up on everything, you were doing heroin. But that was a relatively small number. The vast majority were doing pills because those were still cheap enough and people knew what they were. And at the time, you couldn't really fake them. I mean, technically, they could have been faked then too, but they weren't because it was still cheap enough to get them from other states. I know Florida was a big state where uh, even after the hammer kind of came down federally and stuff, they were still turning them out. But the is it? Yeah, it was bad that so many people were buying pills illegally, but is it better that they're buying fentanyl now? I don't think so.
No.
And I don't think anyone, yeah, I don't think anyone would agree with that argument.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at decriminalization, it doesn't bring back the safer, and I get safer as a relative term, but there's no question that it's safer, heroin or Percocet or Vicodin or whatever prescription, right? Even morphine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it doesn't bring back that option, and it doesn't stop the criminal element from selling the fentanyl. So at the end of the day, you have probably more drug use because there's no punishment for it, and you have more crime on top of that. So I don't think it. Have you? I don't know what the right question is here. I guess, do you see any valid argument to the decriminalization option?
No, I don't think that's
Yeah,
a right way to go.
I don't think I've ever heard anything that's convincing. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, other than there's a convincing idea behind the government just shouldn't be involved. Period, whether it's legal or illegal.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not really what decriminalization does. It doesn't get the government out of it altogether. It just stops them from punishing the illegal part. So I don't think that I think the argument kind of ends right there.
Yeah.
Let's take a quick break. If you don't mind, I need to go and grab something to drink here and stretch my legs for just a second.
All right.
If you're good, are you good to go like another 30 minutes or so?
Yeah.
All right, right on. So I'm gonna go ahead and just pause my show. All right, and we're back. So we pretty much covered legalization, decrim. I think that we only talked about it briefly, but I think we agreed. The drug war has been pretty useless. I think that
Mm-hmm.
it's clear with everything being illegal that it hasn't stopped where we're at now. So what's the argument for it?
Yeah.
I don't see one. And as far as the decriminalization in Seattle, it's led to with this issue where people are claiming that weed is the reason all of these homeless addicts have come to Washington. It really isn't. It's the decriminalization. I mean, obviously, if you're doing fentanyl or you're doing heroin or you're doing meth, and you're getting busted for it and having to go to jail and be detoxing and stuff every couple weeks, why not go to a place where you can do it all you
Mm-hmm.
want and nobody's going to stop you?
Yep.
And the same thing is true in San Francisco. The same thing is true in Portland. Portland actually, shockingly, completely reversed their decriminalization. I think it was just this last election season. And I don't know. I haven't been back down there. I mean, I completely wrote off ever going to Portland again for a
Mm-hmm.
period of time, just like I wrote off going to Seattle, because it's just there's no benefit.
Yeah.
It's incredible how bad those places have become in just the last, like I said, it's really the last like 8 years. Yeah, I don't. Yeah. Um, in fact, one of the things that really what really summarizes the point to me for about progressivism and about the state and everything that's happened over the last kind of 12 to 8 to 12 years. Uh, for the last 12 years, we had the same governor. His name was Jay Inslee. He actually tried running for president against Trump for like 5 minutes. So some people are relatively familiar with his name. He only ever got like 1 or 2% in the polls, so I think he made it to one debate. In 2020, I think it was, and he got on the Howard Stern show. Which are you familiar with Stern?
Somewhat.
I can't stand the guy. I get that he was huge in radio and that he was funny back in the day. It's not necessarily my type of comedy. I'm not talking on it or anything, but as far as my uh, consciousness of him, he's always been a lunatic, radical that is just full of himself. So I've never really seen the funny part,
Mm-hmm.
because he's one of those people that just has gone off the deep end because of Trump. And I get, it's not that I care if your politics are different, but Trump has really driven certain people on the left just absolutely crazy. I think he's one of those examples. But but he does have a relatively big platform, so people are somewhat familiar with Inslee's name outside of Washington because of that. Anyway, he was governor uh, for 12 years, I believe, because I think it's 4-year terms. You can be, I don't know if there is a 3-term limit in Washington or if there is just no limit and he just decided to retire after the 3rd term
Mm-hmm.
because basically all the damage he did was done and he wanted to get out before it all came down, before it all came crashing down,
Mm-hmm.
which is exactly what happened. Uh, you know, they make all these changes, and it's not until a few years down the road that they really start to come to fruition. Kind of like what we've seen with a lot of what Joe Biden did. I mean, his changes were bad enough that they started to hit him the 2nd year into his term, but we
Yeah.
haven't really enjoyed the full the full weight of the misery until uh, about now, really. And there's still several things set to come if Congress doesn't overturn them, like uh, the EV mandates and the restrictions on natural gas, and all of these other things that have trigger dates farther down the road that, unless they get overturned, we're still going to have to live with. And then also, like, for example, him banning oil drilling, which thankfully, Trump is basically just ignoring those things, which
Yeah.
good for him, because there was no constitutional authority to do it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But if those things were allowed to come to fruition, it might be 10 years before we really see the damage from it.
Yeah.
But in 10 years, it's going to be catastrophic. And it's funny to me, he banned oil drilling in the tiny sliver of Alaska that we specifically set aside for drilling oil. It,
Mm.
but this is why, and see, this is why progressives are so good at the long game. They changed the name. It used to be called, back in just prior to World War II, I think, so like 1930s or so. It was the Navy. It was the Naval Oil Reserve something. I forget the full name.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, after we bought it from Russia, we discovered there was oil there. The government set aside a small chunk in the northern end of Alaska, and there was 2 of them. One was set aside for commercial leases to provide oil for the United States and natural gas. One was set aside specifically for military reserves so that we could fuel our Navy, because at the time, all of the Navy was running on oil. Now it's mostly nuclear, and there's still a lot that run on oil, but the aircraft carriers and stuff run on nuclear power.
Mm.
But what happened was, eventually, after probably 1960s or so, and I'm going off my head, so I might be off on the years, but the timeline is roughly around 1960 or so. The government gave that uh, the Navy gave it back to the government so that the government could open it for commercial drilling, because they basically decided, one, this isn't super constitutional to have the government drilling oil, and 2, it wasn't very effective. Basically, it was better for the government to keep the land, but to allow commercial drilling on it, to allow companies to come and do the drilling. And so that's what they did. And then, somewhere between the 1970s and now, as the progressives really rose to power again, because we had the progressive era in the early 1900s, but when the neo progressives rose to power, they've renamed it 1 or 2 times, and probably 20 years ago plus, they renamed it the Wild Alaska Nature Reserve or something. That's not the name, but something
Mm-hmm.
along those lines. That's very environmental sounding.
Yeah.
And at the time, conservatives just let it happen because who cares what it's called, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now, 20 years later, 30 years later, when Biden says, we got to protect this nature reserve, people go, yeah, why are we drilling oil in a nature reserve? It's not a nature reserve. It's a freaking oil reserve, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
desolate wasteland. It's literally, if you look at it on the map, there's no trees, there's no nothing. it's just dead dirt everywhere because it's so freaking cold all the time. Ooh, uh-oh, I've never ran into this problem before. Oh, you know what? It should be fine if I just do that. Getting the low power warning on my phone, but I just realized that I had the screen on the whole time for no reason. And the only way I'm making this work is by physically having my phone plugged in to the audio. But anyway, I forgot where I was going with that. Just that progressives are very calculating and long term thinking, but nonetheless, coming back to the opioid thing, you know, it's a very personal thing for a lot of people, and I get that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people want somebody to punish, and that's part of the problem. A lot of people uh, don't see how making something more available could possibly lower the use of it, which I
Yeah.
get. And I'm not necessarily promising that legalizing it would lower the use, but I only see upside from legalizing it. And here's why when it comes to opiates specifically. The way it is now, you can get it anywhere you want anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But there's nothing that's punishing the crime. There's nothing that's even when it comes to the tweakers petty crimes, and I call them tweakers, most of
Yeah.
them are fentanyl addicts at this point, but it was meth before fentanyl down
Mm-hmm.
here because meth was cheaper.
Yeah.
I guess that's a pretty Pacific Northwest specific thing, but or at least traditionally it has been. Meth wasn't too big other than like Arizona in the Pacific Northwest, I think.
It was
But
pretty big here in Oklahoma City. Both
was
my
it?
parents were meth addicts.
Oh, okay. So you're kind of familiar with this too,
Mm-hmm.
then, as far as personally.
Yeah.
But do you mind me asking? Are they clean now? Do they move on to something
Um,
else?
they lost their rights to me and my three brothers when I was 16 years old, and I decided at that point to not have any contact with them. So as
Okay,
far as I know, I think my dad is still using, but I have no idea about my mom.
okay, fair enough. And really, I mean, that's all you can do when
Mm-hmm.
and that's the hardest part is, you know, eh, you're never going to unless you completely take away every freedom they have,
Yep.
you're never going to get an addict to stop until they're
Mm-hmm.
ready to.
Yep.
Period.
I agree with that.
And you can be there for them. I can only imagine how difficult it is if it's your kid, right? I
Mm-hmm.
thank God my kids are young enough that I haven't had to worry about it yet, but one day I will. And I really worry about raising them where we are right now
Mm-hmm.
because it's so prolific, but it's just I can understand that it's got to be impossible to want to cut your kid off, but you don't necessarily have to cut off contact with them to stop enabling them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Timmy is a great example. Uh, my co-host, he's just my friend, but I call him my brother, and
Yeah.
he's been my closest friend for a long time, and that's why it's absolutely killed me to watch this play out, and I give him credit every time I can for how good he is doing now because I know it wasn't easy, but for a period of time there, I just I couldn't let him around the house. I can't let him around the kids, and even if I didn't have kids, I still wouldn't let him come around. I'll still talk to him on the phone. I'll still see how he's doing. At least the times he was coherent enough. Um, I still met him on a rare occasion. Go have a beer with him or just go talk to him for a bit or whatever if
Mm-hmm.
he needed. All right, I had to back up there for a second because I accidentally said a town that was a little too close for comfort, but I would give him a ride places or whatever on a rare occasion, but I would never give him money. I would never, um, I couldn't do things for him on a daily basis or see him on a daily basis or whatever. I just had to cut him out of my life, other than the occasional communication to make sure he's still alive and doing okay. And are you ready to do something about this yet? No. Okay, well, I'm always here when you are. He always knew that if he needed something and was willing um to get clean or whatever, I would do whatever it took for that. um Several times, I drove him up to detox or came to pick him up from treatment or whatever, and I was always willing to do that. But that's about all you can do until they're ready.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else, you're harming yourself and you're enabling it. But so I understand your desire to cut them off. I can only imagine how,
Yeah.
well, I can't imagine a little bit how difficult it is when it's your parents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Part of it was
uh,
that there was like a restraining order and no contact order on us until we turned 18. So I kind of just
right.
like just kept, not speaking to them.
Kept
So
it up. Yeah, probably made it a little easier since you didn't have
mm-hmm.
a choice
Yeah.
at first
And
anyway.
my dad wasn't a good person aside from his drug use. Like that's one of my reasons for like I got even into this legalization thing is because I believe drugs or no drugs, if everything was illegal, I just feel like my dad was probably going to be the person that he was. Uh, Him and my mom never married, and he beat her all the time, cheated on her, did all kinds
That's
of awful
unfortunate.
stuff, couldn't keep a job, partly because of his drug use. But
Right.
so most of it was like, and technically my mom chose the drugs and him over us. She had a sweet deal with the DHS, and they were going to put her through rehab and put her in a women's center and all this. But she just had to like sign this order that she was no longer going to have contact with my dad because my at this point the state had fully decided my dad does not need to have rights to us.
Right.
So then it just came up to my mom, and she ultimately signed over her own rights. It wasn't even like the courts forced her to do it or anything. They gave her the option, and she took that. So that with that reasoning, I was like, well, she obviously didn't want to be with us, but there's obviously it's a lot more complicated than her just being like, oh, I want the drugs. But
Right. Right. Well, yeah, I mean, you're not in your right mind necessarily. And
mm-hmm.
I always, when I was, I thankfully my issues with it were fairly brief, because of those prescriptions. But I do know uh, what what is it called? Detoxing isn't the right word. I mean, it's one word, but it's not the word I'm trying to think of. But I know, what that feels like and how absolutely awful it is. And I didn't really have a problem when I was taking the drugs. They didn't really change who I was. But when I was coming off of them, it, I I was not recognizable. I mean, the thoughts that went through my head, the things that I was willing to do to get more that I would never even consider in my right mind were, I don't even like to talk about it because it's
Mm-hmm.
so uncomfortable that my brain was there. And
Yeah.
thank God I didn't. For I mean, I did things I'm not proud of, but I didn't do anything that I can't live with, thankfully.
Yeah.
But mostly just lying to family and stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
the things that I was willing to do are there's pretty much no limit, and it's not because I was willing to do those things. It's just that chemical change in your brain
Yeah.
is it's hard to describe if you don't know it.
Mm-hmm.
The one plus side though to opiates, and I don't know exactly how it is with meth. um from what I understand, it's meth is probably one of that's the one that it messes you up while you're high rather than while you're coming down. And that coming down really isn't that difficult. You might get a little depressed and stuff because you're not high
Hmm.
anymore,
Yeah.
um, but it's not like alcohol or opiates are. But um, I don't know. I was saying something and I completely forgot. Anyway, um, I'm I'm sorry you had to deal with that.
Yeah.
That's tough. I when I turned 18, I was really angry at my mom
Hmm.
for the same reasons, and she didn't give a sub, but I'm not sure that had the situation come to that, she wouldn't have.
Yeah.
We just thankfully never she never got tangled up with the law, so it wasn't a concern. You know,
Hmm.
um, but I was very angry at her for a long time, and blamed her for my own issues and all of these things, and it's just that doesn't do you any good.
Yeah.
uh, you seem like you've come to terms pretty well with what's
Hmm.
happened and stuff, and you can either let it eat you alive for the rest of your life, or you can recognize
Yeah.
that your parents are humans too, and people
Hmm.
make mistakes, and
Yeah.
it is what it is.
Like I've forgiven them, and like I understand they made choices, and that's all we all do is we make choices. Some are good, some are bad. Some lead to different things, and that's just the choice they made. And so the choice I'm making is just they're not going to know their grandchildren and stuff like that. So
Yeah, and that's tough too. I don't
hmm,
know. Hopefully I'm sorry, did you say it was your fiance or your wife?
wife,
Wife, that's right. You said you were married.
yes.
Um, how are her? Do you guys get along good with her parents or?
Hmm. Their parents are great. I say that she had like the most basic like American child's life. She didn't. They weren't super rich, but they weren't like in poverty like I was. They had enough, and didn't have a lot, but they had enough. So her parents are great. I love them.
Well, that's good, and it's good that your future kids will at least have some grandparents to
Hmm.
enjoy.
Yeah, and I was adopted,
That,
so I have like parents now, but
oh, okay, that's good too.
hmm,
um, but that I mean it's crucial for kids. As crucial as parents are, grandparents serve an important role too.
hmm,
And it's not that you can't raise kids without them, but it's just it's a plus one.
yep, hmm,
It's just another win in the column of raising good kids, I think. And it's just like when it comes to parents, a single parent can raise good kids, but it's going to be twice as hard.
oh yeah,
And you have to be able to fill that missing role, which how do I fill the role of a mother?
yeah,
it, I would have to figure out how to do it if I had to raise my kids alone, but I don't even know where I would begin, and I'm glad I don't have to concern myself with it. And that's something that was part of why I had so much anger for my mom, because I not only did she not fill the role, and me and her have had this conversation. We had it a little bit on this show because I felt it was good. So I'm not throwing my mom under the bus or anything. She knows
hmm,
that we've long since worked this out, but I felt that not only did she not find a way to fill that role of uh, being a dad to me, but I had a stepdad, but she kind of blocked him from being a dad as well.
hmm,
Um, and so he was I love him very much and he's a great guy, but she would never let him punish us, me and my sister. She would never um she would always kind of step in between, and she did that she thought she was doing the right thing, which I understand. She
yeah,
thought she was trying to keep this other man, because we still knew our dad, but our dad didn't have any influence in our lives really. After he tried for a period of time, but then my mom moved us pretty far away, and unless you're seeing both your parents on a very consistent basis, it just doesn't the influence just isn't there. Because every time we went to see my dad, he didn't want to be a dad.
Yeah.
He wanted to have a good time with us. You know, he
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to spend the time. Well, what do I need to discipline you for? You know,
Yeah.
but as a young boy, that's what you need. You need that
Mm-hmm.
discipline,
Mm-hmm.
especially.
Yes.
So my mom thought she was doing the right thing by stopping my stepdad from disciplining me in particular, and trying to kind of keep peace in the house and all that. But ultimately, you know, I can see from my perspective as a dad now how that led to a lot of the mistakes I ended up making
Yeah.
because I didn't have somebody calling, telling me to knock it the hell off, essentially. Um, and it's also caused problems with my actual dad and I. We've started to, you know, reform our relationship ever since my son was born. And it's not, like I said, it's not that we never stopped having a relationship, but it became very superficial because you just grow farther and farther apart, to where you don't even know each other anymore.
Yeah.
And so I would go visit him and stuff, but we'd have dinner and talk a little bit, but we'd have nothing to talk. We'd never talk about anything serious. I didn't feel comfortable with him like he was my dad. He was more just like a friend that I go see sometimes. And so it really took some time to reopen those doors. And really what it was I started, becoming a father myself and being over my head, or at least feeling that way. I I had to find answers somewhere, and obviously I'm going to start with my dad.
Yeah.
But anyway, um, it I don't know. I don't know how we ended up down this road. I don't know if you remember, but
um, yeah, you were talking about where the use of meth was prevalent, and you kind of said like, "Oh, well, I only know it was here," and so I just gave my own perspective on, well, Oklahoma did have a pretty big meth problem because not only was I affected directly by my parents, I just remember billboards everywhere saying like meth, not even once, like don't use anti-meth, like signs were everywhere. So it was a pretty big
do
problem
you
around here.
find, not to go down another path entirely, but do you find those, the stop smoking campaigns, those sort of like dare posters and stuff, do you find that stuff to be effective?
Mm, I think somewhat. I think just educating people is really the best route on things. But, if they're just going to go into like demonizing it and making it look so terrible and awful that like you're going to do it once, like it was fentanyl, you're going to do it once and all of a sudden you're going to have all these problems. There is most
Right.
times with most drugs a safe way to use them. Drink a beer every once in a while, smoke some weed every once in a while, or you can use it safely. But when you're saying like you shouldn't use it at all, no matter what, I don't think that's very effective. You're just
Yeah,
scaring
well,
people.
and kids see through that BS too. You
Mm-hmm.
know, we were told all the time, you can't ever use alcohol, you can't ever smoke weed, it'll ruin your life.
Yep.
But we also see all these people, all these adults around us drinking and smoking and going to work and having families and doing just fine. And so that's not true. What you don't know is where the line is,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think I agree that 100% it's education. I think that education really though is only effective in the home. I don't think there's a whole
Yeah.
lot of effectiveness outside of that. Um, and yes, the the smoking stuff, they've cut down on smoking, and they attribute that to the stop smoking campaigns. But I'm not sure that
Uh,
that was really what did
yeah,
it.
I
I mean,
think
all the kids are
vaping.
vaping now, so
Mm-hmm. Vaping and
what's
then
the
the new
benefit?
nicotine pouches like Zen and stuff. People are switching out
Yep.
of tobacco, but they're still using nicotine.
Right. Exactly. And that's, well, it was pretty inevitable for one. And
Mm-hmm.
then you also have the fact that the government has essentially incentivized that by making cigarettes so expensive.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, and not everywhere, but like in this state, for example, a pack of cigarettes is almost $12 for, if you want name brand or something.
Yeah.
But I can get a vape for $3.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that same sort of thing. Like every time the government tries to step in and take on the role of the parents in trying to curb bad behavior, there's always going to be what they call unintended consequences, but you almost can't call them unintended consequences because we could look at it on a piece of paper and go, this is what the consequence is going to be. They just ignore it. They just pretend that it's not going to happen, and it does every time. And we knew that banning alcohol was going to drive, back in the 30s, we knew that was going to drive alcohol sales underground, and that's what it did. People didn't stop drinking, they just started doing it illegally. And the same thing with guns, the same thing with drugs. It's just an endless cycle. And the upside to legalizing is, one, that the law-abiding citizen that doesn't have a problem with drugs can now utilize those medications again for their intended purposes or for their beneficial purposes. If a contractor who hurt his back on the job lives a much higher quality of life by taking a small amount of Percocet every day, who am I to tell him he can't do that? That's his problem. And a lot of those drugs, for all of its demons, opiates are, when used correctly, they're not just effective, but there's almost no downside. As long as you're not abusing it drastically, they don't kill your kidney, they don't fry your brain, that you can take them long term with almost no side effect, for the average person, of course. And that's not true of almost any drug. Like I said, Tylenol, ibuprofen, those will fry your kidneys if you take them every day for years. Well, I think one's your kidney, one's your liver, but whatever. Same thing. And so you have that advantage, but the only way that works is if legitimate companies are able to sell the product openly, because that is the only thing that will drive out the black market. The only reason the marijuana black market went away was because the legal companies that were able to slap a brand name on it and just do what commerce does, drove the price down to half the price of the illegal stuff within 6 months, and even with the taxes. And now I don't think I ever mentioned it, but now I can go get a gram for $1 at just about any weed store. It won't be the best stuff in the world, but I can get a $1 joint at pretty much all of the weed stores. There's no way to make any money illegally from it, so why would you bother? And it's the only way that I think you drive out the crime and stuff with opiates, for example, or meth or whatever, is by allowing people to go and buy it at Rite Aid or Walgreens or whatever. And then you also, all of that money, I mean, think of all of the money that we spend on trying to enforce drug laws. All of that money is now freed up that you can put towards
I did the calculations on that when I wrote about the opioid epidemic. I could probably pull it up. It's like the amount we spend. Let me pull this over here.
And so you get, all of the cost savings and stuff. You get less. Part of what ruins people's life with it is all of the drug charges and stuff that they get too, from just being a consumer. They're not selling to anybody or anything. They're just using it, but then they end up picking up half a dozen charges, and then they can't get a job even if they do get clean. So there's also, the benefits are quite a long list, but the downsides I don't see as much. Are you able to find it?
Yeah, I'm skimming through this.
I'll give you a second here.
Yeah, this was a long
Most
paper I wrote.
That's fine. I'm trying to organize what thoughts I got left too.
Okay, approximately 565,346 people were in prison for drug related crimes in 2022. The average cost to house an inmate for a year is $36,299. So approximately $20,546,613,154 was spent from taxpayers' money to house people involved in drug related crimes.
You said 20 billion?
Yes, 20.5 billion.
Holy cow. That's
in
more than I
2022.
expected. And that doesn't include all of the law enforcement on top of that, all of the excess border patrol that's required, which I guess is law enforcement too. But all of the man hours and all of that goes into actually getting those people to jail in the first place. Not to mention it, all of the other crime that is subsidized by it. We all recognize finally that there's a massive human trafficking problem in our country. Well, worldwide, but in our country. And that is entirely funded by the illicit drug trade. By having these drugs be illegal and therefore that money going to the cartels instead of to, Pfizer or whatever, which I'm not looking to make Pfizer richer, but as bad as Pfizer is, I can't say they're worse than cartels,
Yeah.
And there's other ways to deal with the problems with Pfizer, but I would certainly rather see that money go to corrupt CEOs than I would to people that are trafficking children. I just I don't see how you can ignore these details to the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Our government has created this by creating the war on drugs. Believe it or not, prior to the war on drugs, and there was still some laws prior to the war on drugs, but if we go back a little further, there were no laws at all that govern these things.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that we need to go back to no laws at all. There should be somebody that fills the role of like an FDA or whatever to make sure that people aren't completely lying about their product and stuff. But a little basic education in school on the way that the drug market takes place, or the legal drug market exists, and that you need to read labels and that you need to be aware of whatever else, could go a long way in protecting people too. If we're talking about a situation where it's completely legal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'd obviously have to be like not available to kids, at least not letting kids just go up and buy these things like alcohol and weed and everything is already. So
yeah, and on one hand I see the argument why, and that's another enforcement issue. I wish that we had a society, I guess, that a store clerk, and this is part of the problem I think with corporations versus mom and pop owned businesses, because when neighbors knew each other and it was your neighbor that owned the local market down the street or the local drugstore or whatever, he's not going to sell your kid fentanyl. But some teenager that's making minimum wage, that there's no law stopping him from doing it, he doesn't care. There's no repercussion societally for him to do something stupid like that. And so I guess I wish we had the type of society still where it wasn't necessary to use the government to prevent sales to children.
Yeah.
But since we don't currently live in that society, hopefully we one day do again, then absolutely. And that's part of why we're able to figure it out now with the rest of the stuff we have. We can put the dangerous stuff behind the counter so that a pharmacist has to give it to you, and there has to be, an age limit on certain things. Um, and then anything else can go on the shelf. There's
Yeah.
no reason that you need, and see, this is part of the problem too, is the government protection of this racket. And what I
Mm-hmm.
mean by that is, why do I need a prescription to buy insulin?
Mm-hmm.
Once I've gone to the doctor and he says, "Hey, you have diabetes. You need to take this much insulin every month or whatever," right? Now, this is kind of a bad example because I think diabetes is better fixed through diet, but
Mm-hmm.
um, regardless, once that's happened, why do I have to go back to that doctor every week to get permission to buy this drug? It it makes no sense, especially in a country that is supposedly free.
Yeah.
I should be able to go to the pharmacy and buy insulin. And yeah, that means that somebody that doesn't have diabetes could buy insulin. But
Mm-hmm.
so what? That's their problem.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, well, but all these dangerous chemicals would then be on the shelf, but drain cleaners on the shelf,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't have a big problem of people going and buying it and drinking it.
Yeah. You can probably
It
point to a couple cases, but that's not enough for me. You know.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be idiots, but just like there's
Mm-hmm.
always going to be crazy people, and you can't punish all of the good people because
Yep.
of the crazy people.
Yep.
It just doesn't work.
Those who give up liberty for safety deserve neither.
Yes, that's one of my favorite quotes
Mm-hmm.
as well. That was Franklin, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have said it throughout like history, but
Oh, that's right. Yeah, it's the
Franklin's
most
one of my
important. Yeah,
favorite.
one of my favorite has become more recently the quote by, God dang it, I just looked it back up the other day too to make sure I was being accurate about who said it. I think it's Jefferson, that, or maybe Paine, that the Constitution was created for a moral and religious people and is wholly inadequate for any other.
Mm-hmm.
And
Jefferson.
the was it Jefferson?
Mm-hmm.
The older I get, the more that one really sticks with me, because not only is it true, clearly, when you start to investigate the idea, looking into our Constitution and our system of government, but um, there's a morality is a really important component in a functioning society.
Yep.
And I think there's a real problem with the fact that atheism has really taken over the left side of the country, in the principle, even if they're not atheists per se, they tend to subscribe to the principle that um, that morality doesn't derive from religion. It just exists. And that's just simply not true. Can I say that it derives only from religion? No, I can't say that. But it doesn't just exist naturally.
Mm-hmm.
People do not naturally believe that killing is bad. People, kids grow up to believe that killing is bad because we raise them to believe that. And without some level of guiding principles, the fact is, every atheist in America is guided by Christian principles, even though they
Yeah.
don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
They were raised in a society that is deeply Christian. And I considered myself to be atheist for a period of time. I was born Catholic, I was raised Catholic, and nothing will make you leave religion faster than growing up in the Catholic Church,
Mm-hmm.
at least in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
But uh, I never believed that all of that pomp and circumstance was necessary to have some sort of connection with God. But I guess I never fully left the belief that there could be a creator. I guess you could say I was
Yeah.
agnostic rather than
Mm-hmm.
atheist. And then I started I started really investigating Darwinism and the core beliefs behind atheism, and you realize this doesn't hold up any better than some religions do, at least in my opinion. And there were there were far too many questions that didn't have reasonable conclusions. Ultimately, at the end of the day, in order to believe to believe the atheist narrative instead of a religious narrative, you still have to believe in something. You have to
Yeah.
believe in something you can't
Mm-hmm.
prove. So no matter what, you're believing in something, whether it's the Big Bang or evolution or whatever. You have to put your belief in
Mm-hmm.
something that you can't see or prove.
Yeah. I think a human without religion is like a shirt without buttons. Someone has, if they say they're atheist, they just may not believe in creationism, God and Christianity, whatever, or may not
Mm-hmm.
think they fit into any religion. So they call themselves an atheist, but at some point you believe in something. It might be a sports team, it might be your political ideologies. There's something that you put your faith in, basically.
Right. Unfortunately, a lot of them seem to put it in their political
Yeah,
ideologies.
that's an easy one.
Uh, but yeah, I mean, it's a natural inclination for us to do,
Mm-hmm.
but uh, regardless, it uh, I don't know. I mean, there's all these places around the world where religion is not dominant like it is here and in a lot of Western countries. Where's the morality in those places? It's pretty hard to find usually. And if there is morality, it's derived from government,
Mm-hmm.
not from religion. But it's not derived from atheism. It's not derived from a belief in science.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't want to get off on that tangent, but I think that you don't have to believe in God to recognize that the principles of Christianity in general, you don't need to pick any particular denomination,
Mm-hmm.
but Christianity in general, the principles that are laid out in the Bible are extremely beneficial functions both to society and to humans in general.
Mm-hmm.
And so and I think that's essentially what the founding fathers did was they took
Yeah.
all of those principles and they tried to take God out of it. Now they believed that you couldn't take God out of it, but they tried to, in setting up the government, remove God from the equation while still utilizing the exact same principles
Yeah.
so that you didn't have that argument, you know. And I think that's why our system of government is as effective as it is. But in rejecting Christianity and stuff, they want to reject uh, those parts of the American society and government too. And it doesn't work without those things. It doesn't work without strong family units. It doesn't work without um, more or less the Ten Commandments, right? It doesn't work without uh, individual freedom and freedom of speech and all of these things. These all came from the Bible.
Yeah.
And so whether you believe in God or not, you cannot believe in God and still recognize that. And that's really what brought me back to religion in the first place was recognizing, yeah, I'm questioning my belief in God or a creator or whatever, in the various stories of these different denominations and different religions. But at the end of the day, I know that these Christian principles and values have been extremely effective tools in creating successful society and a happy human and a happy family
Yeah.
and happy children and successful children. So why wouldn't I follow them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just because I don't believe in God, I can't utilize tools that work.
Yep. I agree with you.
And I think that where I was going with that is that
Mm-hmm.
I think that that is a big part of the solution to um, not just the drug problem, but a lot of our problems in this country. We're trying too hard to make the government fill this role that must be filled by ourselves, that must be filled by the individual
Mm-hmm.
and by the family. And the more we try to pawn those things off on government, the more lost people become.
Yep.
And the problem is you have these particular people on the left, meaning atheists, basically, that are telling people that not only is there no God, but basically all of these principles and stuff are made up and a joke, and then offering them nothing to believe in
Mm-hmm.
place of that. And so where does that leave you? I mean, when I get down to, I my problem with opiates, for example, started because a doctor gave me way too many at way too young of an age for way too small of a problem.
Yeah.
But on top of that, I also had my issues, growing up, my lack of a strong enough father figure and all of that that compounded that. And then I had, I started falling into those very leftist and atheistic beliefs of just looking at all of the negative of the religion I was brought up in and the hypocrisy and all of that, rather than and ignoring all of the positive, rather, which only led me further away from any sort of understanding, any sort of grounding in reality, to the point where you will always end up in the same point, which is, what's the point? What's the point of all this? Who cares?
Yep.
If I'm God, then it doesn't matter what I do. And that's it's a sure way to make an unhappy human being, and an unhappy human being is going to find ways to hurt themselves and everyone around them.
Yep.
Some less so than others, but that's more of just natural variation than it is any difference in belief. And I think that that is where the focus needs to be more than anything, and why legalizing is is ultimately the right way to go, no matter what the
Mm-hmm.
outcome is, because the focus needs to be there, and everything that we mess with on the legal side and try to use government to fill that role is just distracting us from fixing the real problem.
Yep. Because you're kind of
If
pawning
that
it
makes
off
sense.
to the government. You're saying like an individual that could have fixed the problem, you know, through family is now that family has kind of an out to be like, well, let the government deal with it.
Yeah,
That's their job.
absolutely.
It's not my job. Something like that.
Exactly. And you're never going to find happiness or fulfillment in the government, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's There is nothing but an abusive relationship to have from government.
uh,
Well, that's I think we've pretty much let this conversation run its course. Do you have any other points that you want to make sure get covered, or?
I don't think so. I think we got to everything. I think I was able to speak what I needed to say and didn't leave anything out. So
Okay, good. I definitely did, which I never have a problem with. I often have a problem with not letting the uh, the other person speak enough. So I'm
mm-hmm.
glad you feel that way. Um, I'm just, when you do the show alone, I'm sure you've. I don't. Do you? I've only gotten to look at a couple of your shows so far. Do you often do them alone, or do you pretty much
um,
always have somebody?
yeah, well, this will be my 5th episode, so I've only done one solo.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
And yeah, and when you get, I've been in such a habit of doing it alone for a long time.
mm-hmm.
You pretty much can't stop talking,
Yeah,
otherwise it's just dead air.
yep,
And so it becomes a habit, and that makes it difficult sometimes when I have a guest,
mm-hmm.
or when Tim was here and stuff, kind of off and on, because I'm just so used to filling that dead space.
Yep,
But anyway, uh, well, I think that I think that there's 50 other conversations we could now have from this point.
yes,
So you're definitely welcome to be on the show anytime. We can
mm-hmm.
discuss that once we get off the air here. But I'm running up on. I got to get to my son's teacher conference, so I think we'll go ahead and end it right here.
All right.
You want to give your X and your Substack and stuff again, and anywhere else people can find you?
So on Substack, it should be Miller Talk, and then also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, it's Miller Talk, and then you can find me
Miller Talk. Okay.
And then find me on X at the Friendly UPS Man, or is it just Friendly? Yeah, at Friendly UPS Man.
Perfect. So x.com /friendly UPS man or at friendly UPS man. We'll find him on there. And then you said Miller Talk on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify, and then it's millertalk.substack.com to get to the Substack.
Yep.
Perfect. All right. And I really don't need a specific sign off on that. I'll do that later, so I'll just pause it right there.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Miller Talk podcast. I was invited to the Just Between Us show by Chris. Today, we kind of branch off of the last podcast where we discuss drugs in a smaller form and we go in depth with personal experiences. We mostly talk about the opioid crisis and how the war on drugs is affecting America. Thank you, Chris, for having me on. This is the podcast from my perspective. You can find him on X at JBU_show and on Spotify at Just Between Us and Apple Podcasts. And with that, let's get to it.